Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this RAN Practitioners webinar. I don't know if you have all heard about RAN, so let me first give a short introduction. RAN Practitioners is a network funded by the EU. For RAN practitioners, it's PCVE practitioners working on all sorts of radicalization and polarization issues. Malesh Shahood, Martin Bridet, and myself, Rick Scheel, are working for RAN practitioner staff. So we organized this network. And today we're organizing this webinar, an important webinar on the latest trends for local PCVE coordinators. Because over the last years, a lot of developments have taken place, mostly due to the COVID pandemic, of course. We've seen a rise in conspiracy narratives, but also in right-wing extremism, also partly left-wing extremism next to the still existing Islamist extremism, but also online cut and paste ideologies, people kind of taking their bits and pieces of different types of extremism. And of course, more recently, the war in Ukraine started and brings us new challenges also for local PCVE work. Therefore, it's crucial to keep up with what is happening. And that's why we have organized this webinar today. And I'm glad we have the excellent speakers with us. Shortly, we will first hear from Lorenzo Marinone, who will speak about the right and left-wing extremism. Secondly, we will hear from Alexander Ritzman, who will speak about conspiracy narratives and how they evolve and how to react and how to interact with believers in those narratives. And let me introduce our first speaker is Lorenzo Marinone. He has an outstanding knowledge of security, violent extremism, and radicalization. He has extensively worked on these issues with Italian institutions, such as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Defense, as well as with NATO and UN agencies, such as the FAO. He will provide a comprehensive overview of the latest trends of radicalization and extremism and zoom in on the threats stemming from right-wing and left-wing extremism. So Lorenzo, over to you, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much for inviting me today. Today I will talk about left-wing and insurrectionary anarchists in the first part of my presentation, and about right-wing extremism in the second part. Both presentations are structured in the same way, so I will touch upon the latest trends in ideology, and then in recruiting and other manifestation techniques, and third, I will talk about the level of threats and forms of violence. Let's start with the left-wing and their ideology. Usually it's a bit difficult to grasp what left-wing is. There's no definition. And this is relevant today when we are talking about the latest trend in left-wing extremism, because on the one hand, you have a very static ideology. There has been no significant evolution over the past 50 years or so. On the other hand, when you look at left-wing and anarchist landscape, you see a very heterogeneous landscape. You see a lot of different groups that might also be appear like single issue groups. And so you have these two, this dynamic between the two poles. So you can think of, let's say, left-wing as a Rubik's Cube. Left-wing ideology is the whole cube with different sides and different colors, and it's a whole. On the other hand, a single side can be a single group or a movement or an extremist cell, and you can change, shift the sides, the faces of the cube, and you are still inside the perimeter of left-wing ideology, but maybe you are facing something completely different. Why is this? Because from the one hand, you have, let's call it a family resemblance among all these groups. They have common ideological roots in Marxist-Leninist. They share international ties, mostly at the individual level, not just at the group level. They have shared target and shared file, like, for example, anti-NATO, fight against right-wing groups, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, you have a lot of fluidity in the way ideology appears from what these groups do. This is mainly because there's this idea in left-wing ideology of the intersectionality of the fights. This is not just for extremist groups, also in radical left-wing groups and many social movements today. This idea of intersectionality means that you cannot win your fight unless you take into account also other fights. So everything somehow is connected. Like in the Rubik's Cube, you can change and you have to change and to shift the side, because otherwise you cannot get anything done. The other point that matters for fluidity is the selective use of violence. Many groups are both violent and non-violent. They just choose in a given moment when it's useful for them to use violent or non-violent means, and they usually know very well the context at the local level where they act, and they try not to cross the line. So they just try to fly under the radar, and sometimes they can use violent means, otherwise they prefer to use non-violent means. Still, this is rooted in the same kind of ideology. What does it mean? This means that given this fluidity at the local level, at the group level, there's a very high potential for flexibility and also for hybridization, at least at the tactical level. Even if you don't have any interesting feature, novel feature in terms of ideology. So you will have mainly groups or movements behaving in an opportunistic way, and most of them can appear like a single issue group. Now, lately, even if there is no, let's say, ideological feature that has emerged as new over the last, let's say, 3 to 5 years, there are still some issues that are long-standing issues in left-wing ideology that have become more prominent. And here I have just highlighted 3 of them. The first one is the climate crisis, and it plays very well, it resonates with a very common narrative among left-wing and anarchist extremism, which is the narrative about the commons. So the defense of the commons, or if you want to look at the other side of the coin, the fight against private property and what it symbolizes. Then the second issue that has gained more prominence today is connectivity. Here, of course, virtual connectivity, for example, 5G mobile connection is something that very recently has become more evident because of the COVID-19, all the attacks that have been performed against 5G infrastructure. But connectivity also in the sense of physical connectivity. So, for example, highways projects, high-speed railways projects, and so on and so forth. Everything that goes in the direction of globalization on the one hand, and it resonates very well with the narrative of defending social justice and fighting against inequalities. The third issue of concern that has become more prominent is related to other technologies. For example, advanced genome editing, CRISPR technology, or artificial intelligence, or augmented or virtual reality. And the opposition towards these technologies resonates with the narrative about state control, about globalization, again, the power of global capital against the people. This does not mean that there have been attacks or violent acts connected to these issues, but still they are very relevant in the narrative they have been used over the last 5 years. How does it play more in practical terms? When it comes to recruiting and how groups behave, well, here we do not have, honestly, so many new things to say about left wing. I mean, it's more or less the same behavior as in the past. In terms of recruitment, left wing is mainly going very slow. It takes time. Radicalization in the left wing is not you cannot compare it with the right-wing rate of radicalization. It's mainly rooted in a given territory, and it's mainly face-to-face. This does not mean that the internet is not used, but still, once again, you cannot compare what is going on in the right-wing landscape with what is going on in the left-wing landscape. The most important thing to note here is that main tactic that left-wing groups use, which is exploiting legitimate social movements, most of the time radical social movements. How these exploitation appears? Well, it's mainly because extremists, and it can also be very small groups of extremists. You do not have to think of very structured groups. So even small cells or 3 to 4 individuals, they see these social movements as some promising recruiting pools. So they try to infiltrate them in order to make contact with people, with activists, and to radicalize them. Or they try to take over the whole movement, but this is rare, or to radicalize the overall attitude of these movements toward authorities. Which kind of social movements I'm talking about? I'm talking about mainly about NIMBY or LULU groups. LULU stands for locally unwanted land use, or route to housing movements, LGBTQI+ movement, and the movement for climate, like Fridays for Future. One example of these, very recent, in Centro Sociale Scatasuna in Torino, Italy. Centro Sociale Scatasuna is not a group, it's a Centro Sociale, left-wing of orientation, ideological orientation, but activists there are both radical and extremist, but it's not a homogeneous group. Okay, they've been worked up for 3 years, so since 2019. And 2 weeks ago, we learned from recordings that they were discussing how to infiltrate and how to hegemonize the movement, the Italian branch of the Fridays for Future, and the NOTAV movement. The NOTAV is the movement, the citizens movement that protests against the high-speed railway connection between France and Italy since the 90s. So it's a very well established. They were trying to hegemonize, actively trying to do this. In terms of level of threat and forms of violence, there is nothing really new. I mean, in terms of forms of violence, you still have mainly arsons, sabotage, and most importantly, damage against property, compared to opposite to damage against people, attacks against individuals. But we have just one single instance recently of one cyber attack, which has been attributed to a left-wing extremist group in August 2020 against a Swiss-based security company. Of course, this is not a trend because it's just one single instance, but we know that many groups in several European countries are trying to recruit activists. So they are basically trying to acquire some cyber skills of their own. This, again, is hardly something that it's coordinated all over Europe. It's more likely that it's a single group that are trying to achieve their goals with local agendas, but still this can become a trend in the future. As far as the emerging threats are concerned, they are mainly related to a kind of convergence with right-wing extremism. In one instance, we can talk about at the strategic level, this convergence with right-wing extremism. In the case of red-brownism, so when the red component, left-wing, meets the brown component, neo-Nazi component. And this is not something new, again, of course, but it's been exacerbated by the war in Ukraine. In fact, the narratives and were behind red-brownism that resonated with both left-wing and right-wing groups were mainly fueled by the Kremlin. So the war in Ukraine provided just the perfect context to exacerbate the situation and to use these narratives against state authorities here in Europe. In other two cases, we can talk about a convergence with the right-wing extremists at a more tactical level. This is the case of anti-establishment or anti-authorities protests with the COVID-19 crisis, so the no lockdown, no green pass protests. You had both left-wing and right-wing extremists behind the slogans like there's a health dictatorship taking place. But I think that from the point of view of left-wing, this is becoming less relevant today. In the first phases, we saw a lot of anarchist extremists and people from the left-wing, even groups, left-wing extremist group. But now these protests are being hegemonized by the right-wing groups mainly. Why the left-wing extremists joined? Not so much because of conspiracy theories. The conspiracy theories were not the main driver for the left-wing component. Of course, conspiracy theories circulated and are circulating among in the left-wing landscape. They circulate everywhere, basically. But the main difference compared to the right-wing is that they are overall not weaponized. Just one example. Over the last year, there have been a lot of conspiracy theories about concerning Bill Gates. So if you look at the right-wing landscape, Bill Gates was mainly targeted because he was allegedly behind the COVID-19 crisis. It was his fault. He was trying to microchip us all via the 5G. In the left-wing discussions, you had Bill Gates that was under the radar. He was scrutinized because he bought a lot of land in North America. And so the main conspiracy, the main theory was about what wants Bill Gates to do with all this land. Maybe it's related to the climate because he wants to sell carbon credits and make profit out of it. So it's an entirely different dynamic compared to the right wing. The last point, accelerationism. Accelerationism is a bit of ideology which basically says in times of crisis, and we are in times of multiple crises, it's better if you act immediately and in a very effective and powerful way in order to accelerate your agenda. It's the best way to achieve your goals. And this is something that that resonates with right-wing extremists lately and can bring to cooperation at least at tactical level. I'm sorry, I have to really speed up because I'm taking too much time. So let's go to the right-wing presentation. Here, there's so much that can be said. I just want to focus on a few critical features, what I think is really relevant. The first, from the point of view of ideology, is the ongoing process of reassemblage of right-wing ideology. And this is something that is concerning not just the extremists, but also radical groups and also the far right, I mean, established movements and legitimate parties represented in European parliaments. There's a process of reassemblage going on. What's the main goal of right-wing extremists here? Is to exploit this process in order to become more acceptable. And this is done mainly through three pillars: ethnopluralism, mainstreaming, and normalization. Let's start with ethnopluralism. This is basically the idea that they are leaving aside, they say they are leaving aside the racist and xenophobic part of their traditional ideology, and they just respect people of different origin, ethnic origin, and of different culture. But they say we want ethnopluralism in the sense that each state should be pure. So one state for one ethnicity and one culture, do not mix. So we are not against other people, we are not racist, we just want them to stay home and to leave us in peace. And this is something that is used also to, this is supported by many radical right groups, not just extremists, and it basically provides cover for groups that still endorse a much more extreme version of these ideologies, so which are racist and have xenophobic ideas, and they use these to appear more acceptable toward the public discussion. Of course, these ideology, ethno-pluralism, also resonates very well with one of the most important and widespread conspiracy theories in the right-wing landscape, which is the conspiracy about the Great Replacement. Mainly because they say we do not want them here, and so it's the state authorities' fault, the government's fault, because they allow immigrants in because they want to replace us. They do not say white race, maybe, but they are still thinking in terms of white race and Christian, with Christian roots most of the time. The other two pillars, mainstreaming and normalization. Here, there are some very interesting features. Mainstreaming means just to go mainstream, to have the right to access a mainstream platform and discussion with ideas that are perceived as normal. This happened with a cross-pollination, which is maybe the most the newest trend we are seeing today. They are right-wing extremists sometimes try to reframe some issues that belong traditionally to the left-wing agenda. And they use this process of reframing in order to push their own agenda, of course. Just some example, this is done with the environment, with LGBTQI+ rights, for example. When there was the migration crisis in Europe, there's been these slogans widely circulated among certain right-wing groups, which says, save bees, plant trees, shoot refugees, which is supposed to be ironic, but it's not ironic at all. And it connects a part of their agenda, which is eco-fascist in nature, to anti-migration agenda, which is not easy to sell under certain conditions. Or another example can be homonationalism, which is used to endorse LGBTQI+ rights in order to fight against Muslims, because you say basically that Muslim religion, Islam, is against LGBTQI+ people. Another example is free speech. This again is taking cover behind liberal rights like the right to free speech, and at the same time to attack the mainstream media or the establishment or the government when someone says that what they are saying is not normal. And then mainstreaming happens a lot in the right-wing landscape, as Alexander will explain in detail in the next slot. Conspiracy theories are one of the main drivers for mainstreaming and normalizing far-right extremist idea. Here, I just want to point out one single feature which allows this process to go on and to be so effective, which is the fact that so many conspiracy theories today are crowdsourced. This means that you have a lot of different platforms, because the trend is that you do not have anymore just Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. You have a lot of fringe platforms, and you can use them building specific subcultures that are in fact evolving, making these conspiracy evolve, and anyone can contribute. This is where far-right extremists enter the picture and infiltrate these subcultures and influence them in order to incorporate some right-wing extreme bits of ideology. In terms of recruiting, the most interesting point here, I think, is the way the right wing today uses post-irony. What's post-irony? Post-irony is basically a way to blur the borders between truth and irony by means of ambiguity. So if you look at the image here, this is a post on a Telegram channel, and there's the stereotypical representation of a Jew, and it reads, "I caused the current thing." It is supposed to be ironic in the sense that the meaning should be the Jews are scapegoated. So they are allegedly behind everything that happens, every crisis, and this is not true. But the way the far right is using these kind of memes by, for example, just sharing these with the phrase, "This is literally what is happening today," they just turn upside down the meaning. So they are saying, yes, this is true. Jews are behind all the conspiracy that are going on in the world and all the crises. So it's all the Jews' fault. And it's very difficult to understand where the border is. And so you can also this provides cover to right-wing extremists behind this thin veil of irony, which is not ironic, in fact, to share their ideas. My last slide in terms of emerging threats, as we have seen in during the last mass shooting, there is an increasing interest in paramilitary training. This is something that is happening in the US, but not only in the US. So it's something that is also in the European context. In the way they use internet, one of the key trends today, I think, is how they use, how they behave in swarms online. So I was saying before that there is this multiplication of online platforms, and they are coordinating attacks, mainly shit posting, but it can also be doxing or other kinds of attacks. They are coordinating these attacks using a given platform, but they are using different platforms to carry out actually the attacks. So this is a very complex behavior which requires coordination, which requires mass numbers, but it's also easy to access because you can simply take place if there's someone that is coordinating. So again, crowdsourcing is something that here enters the picture, and it's a very important feature of today's far-right extremism. Connected to this, my last point is how subcultures that are growing online translate into the offline world. These subcultures are becoming more and more normalized online, and they are being sold in the offline world, mainly locally, in a much easier way than before. So there's a very close connection between what's going on online in an international place where the coordination can be in another country or even in another continent, and what's going on in terms of radicalization on the ground, mainly at the local level. And this is my presentation. Thank you.
And let's now move to our second presenter, Alexander Ritzman. He is working with the Counter-Extremism Project in Berlin on topics of internet regulation and the effective countering of extremist and terrorist actors and content online. He has extensive knowledge of extremist ideologies, narratives, and strategic communications. And he will zoom in on the latest trends on these conspiracy narratives and their role in boosting extremist ideologies, recruitment, and radicalization. So Alexander, without any further ado, over to you.
Thank you, Rick. So my presentation, I think, will connect neatly to Lorenzo's input. And I try to tailor this to the core audience here, which are PCVE coordinators. So there are different versions on how to talk about this. So the presentation is called Tales of Heroes and Dragons, Why People Believe in Dangerous Conspiracy Narratives and What to Do About It. The key functionality at some point, as a political scientist, I was asking myself, is it enough to describe what these narratives supposedly are about? And do I not need to understand better why human beings follow these narratives, under what circumstances? So this is, of course, relevant for developing alternative and counter narratives, strategic communications, and also effective intervention. So I'm just briefly touching this, but I think it's still important to highlight that point of the story. So these narratives promise purpose, community, belonging, safety, security, relief of responsibility, scapegoating. Somebody else is responsible for my life or for the problems in the world. Status upgrade. When I join this group, I will be a very special person. I'm a knowledgeable person. I am not a sheep. I'm red-pilled. I know everything while others are very stupid. And of course, there's a promise of heroism and call for adventure for many individuals who consider and hear about these narratives. And usually humans are open to such kind of promises for satisfying that need of belonging or status upgrade when they are in crisis, when we are in crisis, feeling alone, insignificant, disrespected, financial trouble. So there is a connectivity. So conspiracy narratives and those who push them are basically advertising a solution to people's problems. Not everybody has that problem, but some people have, and then this is obviously a somewhat interesting solution to deal with reality. So this then means that you could consider conspiracy narratives as empowerment, a tool for self-help, a tool to feel better. And I think this is important when we try to deal with this, when we plan interventions and similar things. So, how to feel better, the logic of most conspiracy myths. So this is true, in my understanding, really for most narratives. There is usually a hero, a dragon, and a maiden that is supposed to be saved, or a community that is supposed to be protected. So the dragon in some scenarios would be the government, Bill Gates, George Soros, the Great Reset, the Great Replacement, the New World Order, the Jewish conspiracy that is behind everything. So that will be the dragon. And this is one of the oldest stories in human history. A community then would need to be saved, and you could become that hero. Follow the call to adventure. That is a core functionality of most conspiracy narratives. And if you listen to stories and you identify, this sounds familiar, then it is most likely a conspiracy myth and narrative. So diving right into far-right extremism, far-right extremists claim two things: that they're victims, they're under threat, the Great Replacement, meaning that there's a conspiracy to destroy the white race. It's basically a white genocide narrative. And on the other hand, claiming to build a better society. It's about family, it's about intimacy, it's about community. That's important to understand, because usually our analysis focuses on the terrible things these people do or say, but they justify what they do with these pictures, which are all from their Telegram channels or other social media sources. Now, if you look to the very right, we have to save the children. This is a narrative that connects far and extreme right-wing groups with some conspiracy myth and narratives. And I'll dive into that right now. So in the context of, there's so many conspiracy narratives, and they've always been there. Many of them are just updates of old stories. There's very little invention in this field. One is definitely an old one, that is the flat earth, right? So the narrative that we're actually in a flat earth, there's a conspiracy of government of not telling us the truth. And this guy here called himself Mad Mike, built a rocket to fly into the sky to check if the earth is flat or round. He was supposed to find that it is flat, but unfortunately he died in the process. So this is dangerous, but only to those who believe that this narrative might be true, right? We're looking as PCVE practitioners also into danger towards others. So here we come to narratives often surrounded with children, children's issues, protection, that they're satanic worshippers, rapists, pedophiles, human traffickers. And some of you will know that this is basically a QAnon narrative. As I said, it connects to a strong far-right extremist narratives against child abuse and death penalty for child abusers. So what to look out for to differentiate between these different kinds of narratives would be, for example, to look at this apocalyptic dimension. When the conspiracy narrative says the end is near, there's an existential threat to our group, and it's imminent, and outrageous crimes are being committed. For example, child abuse. I would say this is a strong set of indicators that violence is more likely, not necessarily, but more likely than compared to other kinds of narratives. There's a paper that the RAN has published on this specific issue, and you can look it up. It's about harmful conspiracy myths. So what's the role of social media here, right? What's new? The stories, most of them are very old, just put in new clothes. Now, our brains are also very old, and the last update that our brains supposedly have received was about 70,000 years ago. That was about consciousness. So we can reflect all day of who we are and where we belong and what life is about and what comes after death. Now, the role of social media is that it allows tribal signaling because we are very group focused. In the past, it seems that those who stayed in close groups when they, for example, encountered a bear in the woods had more offspring than those who wandered in the woods by themselves and encountered that bear. So there's a biological selection, possibly anthropologists suggest that, for strong group need. So this means that we want to signal our group, our tribe, that we're with them, that we're strong, that we're funny, that we're relevant, that we punish the others. Now, this has always been the case, but usually you would have to go to a meeting of that group. You would have to go into a pub or to some sort of march. Social media allows you and rewards you to do this 24/7, 24 hours, 7 days a week. It's basically an outrage and fear festival. Not for everyone. It could also be kitten videos or dog videos. But if you have that tendency, if you have that urge, that need, then the algorithms will usually feed you that. Algorithmic amplification of the things that you supposedly are interested in is a key issue here. So Facebook, YouTube, TikTok feed us with what we supposedly want and not what we need. So they are basically value free. In the core, they argue, who are we to decide what you're supposed to see? If you have a tendency to look at violence or to feel empowered by looking down on others, we will feed you those stories. And it's a very long and painful process for everybody involved to make clear to the companies and policymakers that some sort of regulation and moderation obviously needs to take place here. But the point here is that the companies, for example, would say, well, if you are interested into heroin, we will give you heroin. Or if you're interested in sugar all day, we will provide you with sugar all day. And in real life, this would kill people. Here, this does not necessarily kill people, but it could. And it feeds into some of our basic needs. And that's why social media, I think, basically are accelerators, are basically make things worse. The bad parts of human nature are being supported by this, and some of our good parts as well, obviously. So look at this, and you might understand this immediately. That's a meme, a far-right meme, right? So this is Anakin Skywalker who turns into Darth Vader later, and so on. You don't have to get what's behind this. Just read what it is. It says, I hate big bands and all the, not big bands, but big banks, multinational corporations, and so on. I love nature. And the future mother of Luke Skywalker. This is not their real dialogue, right? This is the meme. Says, you must be left-wing, right? And then she realizes, what, you might not be left-wing. So they're playing, like Lorenzo mentioned before, with commonalities of ideologies. So are the extreme right and the extreme left, for example, are they so different? Yes, in many important issues, but there are similarities. So what are these similarities, overlapping and potentially uniting conspiracy narratives? So in the center here, you have explicitly anti-Semitic narratives that have been around for 1,000 years. Conspiracy of Jews to poison the dwells, to be responsible for the big historic plagues, the New World Order, the Rothschild, big finance and all that. This is explicitly anti-Semitic. You have other narratives that are not always, but often anti-Semitic. Big finance, big pharma, Bilderberger, Davos, Great Reset. We can talk about these in detail if you like later. And there's a sort of narrative that is also related to this conspiracy of liberal elites. Now, this is a simplification, right? So all models are wrong, but some are helpful. And I think, I hope this might be helpful. So if we look at right-wing, that's not all they are about, but that is important to them, right? Anti-EU, US government, anti-capitalism elite, anti-big finance, anti-big pharma, anti-corona policies. Now, sovereign citizens have the same set of what they agree about, what they're against here. And you see the arrows, right? Thick arrows mean there's a strong connection, and thin arrows mean there's sometimes shared position here. This goes to Islamist extremists. Just regarding anti-corona policies, there are different positions. Then, of course, those who are specifically and mostly about corona policies, the radicals, not regular people who have a right to be against whatever, but those who are also involved in promoting violence. You have some esoteric milieu that is similar principles. You have climate change radicals. So this is not Friday for Future. This would be Extinction Rebellion or The Last Generation. And of course, you have anti-fascists and Antifa. So there's a large segment of conspiracy narratives of opponents that can unite different milieus. And parts of this we've seen in the corona pandemic, where suddenly people were marching together and they were as surprised as we were that that is possible, right? So this shows that there is potential for cooperation because they share common enemies. This does not mean that they all will cooperate. It just means that they have something to agree upon. So what's next then? Cooperation and conflicts. I mean, it's in a way, it's obvious. Climate change, right? Climate change is the next big thing. When other pressing crises are over, this will be policy-wise, public debate-wise, the next thing. So we will have, I assume, Antifa, climate change radicals, and esoteric milieus call for harder, faster, more effective government measures to deal with climate change. And we will have slower, less severe, fewer government measure calls from the anti-corona policies radicals, sovereign citizens, and right-wing. So this is the new spin, maybe, that we would be here having two opposing forces, right? In the corona situation, most demonstrations were purely against the government measures, and the violence was mostly coming from these kinds of demonstrations and activities and clandestine groups and attacks. Here we could encounter a situation where potential violence and extremism is coming from both sides of a spectrum. Now, recommendations. What can we do? What should PCVE coordinators consider? After all I said, still be realistic and don't over-exaggerate the threat, right? So there's also good news. There are studies that say that the trust in scientists, for example, has increased over the last couple of years. So we still talk about a small minority compared to the whole population of any given country. Small meaning it could be up to 5, 10, 15%, but still, compared to the rest, it is a minority. And we should make sure we're not pushing fearful ideas without good reason, right? So strategic communication, I think, should be an important part here. Do no harm. It is legitimate to oppose government policies. Obviously, if we stigmatize people, it will be hard for them to come back into the center and for us to see them as, people that we want to have back into the center. So there's a tricky line of making clear what is legal and illegal and what is despicable is one of those terms, right? So we don't want to go down these roads and stigmatize people who are upset about something because it will make the problem bigger. I mean, that's my concern. Governments also need to be transparent about the mistakes they make. If not, this will feed into conspiracy narratives, and it's okay to make mistakes under, uncertainty. But just be transparent about it. I know this is more complex than it sounds right now, but it is important. Focus on the dangerous conspiracy narratives because there's so much stuff coming up, or has been in the last couple of years. Upgrading by downgrading. So narratives that say we are chosen and the others are less worth than we are. They are based on degradation or dehumanization. This is a clear risk indicator from my understanding. As I mentioned before, the end is near, this existential apocalyptic threat against the group that claims that there is a conspiracy against them. And the moral outrage of unbearable crimes is also an indicator. So because there's so much going on, I would recommend to focus on narratives and groups that promote these three in combination. That is another mechanism of selection, of course. Now, when we look at what's been happening over the last years, there's networks, there are conspiracy entrepreneurs. You see a lot of people that have been around for a while. So they might have been organizing activities against the financial crisis, the euro crisis, immigration, refugees, anti-Islam protests. Some of them are new to this, but there is a network. There are individuals who are basically professional entrepreneurs of promoting conspiracies. And here following follow the money approach and a network approach, investigating tax fraud, money laundering, or other issues, prioritizing those conspiracy entrepreneurs for regular rule of law interventions might have an impact on the size of the movement and the potential danger of the movement. This is a tricky issue, but I think it is clear that this is not all organic popping up out of nowhere. So focusing on those who organize it might be an idea. And some of them have received Corona pandemic relief funds. And I would wonder if this has all been done properly, handled by those conspiracy entrepreneurs. Coming to the end here, focus on social media and messenger services, invest into monitoring and analysis capacities, if you can, or partner with local civil society organizations to study the developments so you're not overwhelmed and overly surprised. Put into consideration the algorithmic amplification on some of the platforms here, and pressure policymakers and social media companies to fulfill their duties of protecting users and citizens. This is an ongoing struggle. Companies have a for-profit interest that is legitimate. They operate within the laws that they've been given, and the laws basically let them get away with this. And political decision makers act when there's pressure coming from somewhere. That's normal. That's just that's the way things usually work. So it's our job also to raise our hand and to some degree increase pressure. Be careful with media strategic communication because we don't want to promote conspiracy narratives, right? So some of the channels that I've been monitoring, once they were in the news, the follower numbers doubled or tripled, right? From 10,000 to 30,000 or from 30,000 to 90,000, because suddenly everybody knows this is exciting stuff. So we need, of course, to communicate about this, but we should consider this and think it through in the context of strategic communications when we raise the fear level towards the public. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to your questions.